The city of Meridian Falls sat quiet under an orange October sky, the kind of evening where the wind carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. On the top floor of a glass tower downtown, Eleanor Whitfield stood at her office window, staring down at the private garage across the street, where a red Ferrari 458 sat motionless under a dusty tarp. Eleanor was 44 years old, the founder of a logistics empire worth $900 million, a woman who had built her company from a single delivery van into a fleet that crossed 3 continents. She had negotiated with billionaires, fired executives without blinking, and once closed a merger from a hospital bed after minor surgery. But there was one thing in her life she could not control, one machine that refused to obey her money, her patience, or her will. That machine was the Ferrari. It had belonged to her late husband, Richard Whitfield, a man who died 5 years earlier in a small plane crash on his way back from a business trip in Denver. The Ferrari was the last thing he had touched before leaving for the airport that morning. He had kissed her forehead, patted the hood of the car like an old friend, and said, "I'll drive her again this weekend." He never got the chance. Since that day, the Ferrari had not run. Not once. Not for a single mile. Eleanor had taken it to 17 different mechanics across the country. She flew in specialists from Medina, Italy, paid triple the going rate for house calls from Ferrari-certified technicians, and even had the engine shipped to a private lab in Munich for diagnostic testing. Every single one of them found nothing wrong. The engine turned over. The electronics tested clean. The fuel system was pristine. And yet, the moment the key turned, the car would sputter, cough, and die within 4 seconds, every single time, like clockwork. "Sell it," her sister Diane told her over dinner one night. "You're chasing a ghost, Ellie. Let the ghost go." But Eleanor couldn't let it go. Not because of the money. Money was the least of her concerns. It was the mystery of it, the impossibility of it, the way the world's best engineers stood in her garage scratching their heads at a machine that should have been simple. If the greatest minds in the automotive industry couldn't explain why the car died in 4 seconds, then something deeper was wrong, and Eleanor needed to know what. 3 weeks after that dinner with her sister, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even her. She would try one more time. Not with another famous mechanic, not with another expensive lab, but with an open call. She placed a single classified ad in the Meridian Falls Herald, offering $50,000 to anyone who could diagnose and fix the Ferrari's mysterious failure, no credentials required. The ad ran for 2 days. Nobody serious applied. A few pranksters showed up. One man claimed he could fix it using crystals and positive energy. Eleanor sent him home. On the 3rd day, a janitor named Walter Briggs was mopping the lobby floor of Whitfield Logistics when he overheard 2 employees laughing about the ad taped to the break room bulletin board. Walter said nothing. He kept mopping. He was 61 years old, a quiet man with gray stubble and deep lines around his eyes, the kind of face that had seen more than it let on. He had worked as the building's night janitor for 6 years, arriving after everyone else went home, cleaning floors that had already been cleaned, emptying trash cans that were barely full, always polite, always invisible. Nobody at Whitfield Logistics knew that Walter Briggs had once been one of the top propulsion engineers at an aerospace manufacturing plant in Ohio, a man who had spent 22 years designing fuel delivery systems for experimental aircraft engines before the plant closed, and half of Ohio's engineering jobs disappeared overnight. Nobody knew that his wife had passed from cancer 2 years after that, draining what savings they had. Nobody knew that at 61, with a resume too specialized for a shrinking industry, and too old for companies chasing younger hires, Walter Briggs had taken the only steady job he could find, pushing a mop through an office building at midnight. He finished his shift that night, went home to his small apartment on the edge of town, and could not sleep. Something about the ad nagged at him. A car that dies in exactly 4 seconds, every single time, no matter what. That wasn't randomness. That was a pattern. And patterns, Walter knew, always had a cause. The next evening, before starting his shift, Walter approached the front desk and asked to speak with Eleanor Whitfield directly. The receptionist laughed at first, assuming he was joking. But something in his calm, steady voice made her pick up the phone anyway. Eleanor came down to the lobby herself, expecting another crystal salesman. Instead, she found a gray-haired janitor standing with his cap in his hands. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but hear about your car," Walter said. "I'd like to take a look at it, if you'll let me." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "Do you know anything about Ferraris?" "No, ma'am," Walter admitted. "But I know a thing or two about engines that die exactly when you don't want them to." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with bragging that made Eleanor pause. She had nothing left to lose. 17 experts had already failed. "Fine," she said. "You have 1 hour. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., my private garage." The garage was colder than Walter expected, all polished concrete and museum lighting, more suited to displaying art than fixing cars. Eleanor stood off to the side with her arms crossed, flanked by her head of security and her longtime assistant, Grace, both of whom looked at Walter like he had wandered in off the street, which, in a sense, he had. Walter didn't touch the engine right away. He walked slowly around the car first, crouching by each wheel, running his fingers along the undercarriage, tilting his head to listen to the quiet hum of the garage's ventilation system. Eleanor watched, unimpressed, checking her watch. "You have 52 minutes left," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Walter didn't rush. "Can you tell me exactly what happens when it dies? Not what the mechanics wrote in their reports. What you actually saw with your own eyes." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the question. Nobody had asked her that in 5 years. Every technician had gone straight to the engine, the sensors, the diagnostics. Nobody had asked what she had witnessed. "A hesitation," Walter repeated. "Not a stall. A hesitation, then a stall." "Yes. Why does that matter?" Walter nodded slowly, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "Because a stall is what happens when fuel stops. A hesitation before a stall is what happens when something is fighting the fuel." He turned to the engine bay, popped the hood latch, and studied the wiring harness for a long moment. "Ma'am, has anyone ever pulled the fuel pump relay and tested it under load, not just for continuity, but under actual engine load, while cold?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with Grace. I don't know. I'd have to check the reports." 17 mechanics," Walter murmured, more to himself than to her. "And I'd bet my last dollar every one of them tested it warm in a shop during the day, because that's when shops are open." He looked up at Eleanor. "Ma'am, where was this car kept before your husband passed?" "Not this garage. Before." "Our old estate, about 40 minutes north. The garage there wasn't climate controlled like this one." "And the crash," Walter said carefully. "It was in the winter, wasn't it? Early morning flight to Denver?" Eleanor's face went pale. "How would you know that?" "Ice?" Grace asked, glancing at Eleanor for permission. "Please," Walter said. "I need this engine bay cold. As cold as it would have been on a winter morning, before dawn, in an uninsulated garage 40 minutes north of here." They packed ice around the fuel pump relay housing, letting the temperature inside the engine bay drop. Walter waited, patient, checking his multimeter every few minutes, saying nothing. Eleanor's security chief scoffed quietly, but Eleanor herself had gone very still, watching Walter with an intensity she hadn't shown any of the previous 17 experts. Eleanor slid into the driver's seat, her hand trembling slightly on the key, the same key Richard had touched 5 years earlier. She turned it. The engine roared to life, held for 1 second, 2 seconds, and then Walter, standing by the open hood, reached in and gently tapped the fuel pump relay housing with the handle of a screwdriver, once, precisely, at the 3-second mark. The engine did not die. It kept running. 3 seconds became 4, 4 became 10, 10 became 30. The Ferrari's engine settled into a smooth, steady growl that echoed off the concrete walls of the garage, a sound the building hadn't heard in 5 years. Eleanor sat frozen behind the wheel, tears sliding silently down her face, listening to a sound she thought she would never hear again. When Eleanor finally cut the engine and stepped out, her legs unsteady, she looked at Walter as though seeing an entirely different person than the janitor who mopped her lobby floors. "What did you do?" she whispered. Walter held up a small component, no bigger than a matchbox, the fuel pump relay he had removed from its housing. He turned it over in his fingers and pointed to a nearly invisible hairline crack running along one internal solder joint, a flaw so small that Eleanor had to squint to see it even when he held it an inch from her eyes. "This relay controls the electrical signal that tells the fuel pump to keep running once the engine starts," Walter explained. "There's a fracture in the solder here, so small it wouldn't show up on a warm bench test in a shop during the day, but cold metal contracts. In a freezing garage, on a winter morning, this crack would open just wide enough to break the circuit for a fraction of a second, right around the 3 to 4 second mark, cutting fuel delivery and killing the engine. Then, once it stalled and everyone brought it into a warm shop to diagnose it, the metal would expand back, the crack would close, the relay would test perfectly fine, and every single mechanic who ever looked at it would find nothing wrong." Eleanor stared at the tiny, broken part in his hand, the part that had cost her $2 million and 5 years of grief to find. "A vibration crack," Walter continued quietly. "Probably happened the day of the crash, or shortly before. Maybe the car hit a pothole. Maybe it was just age catching up with a hairline weld from the factory. Either way, it only fails under very specific conditions. Cold temperature, right around 3 to 4 seconds after ignition, under full electrical load. Every lab that tested this car did it in a controlled, warm environment, because that's standard procedure. Nobody thought to recreate the exact cold, dark, winter morning conditions of the day it stopped working for good." "How did you know?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know to even think about the cold?" Walter was quiet for a moment, turning the broken relay over once more in his weathered fingers. "Ma'am, I spent 22 years designing fuel systems for aircraft that had to start in Arctic testing conditions. I've seen this exact kind of failure before, more times than I can count. A crack that only shows itself in the cold and hides itself in the warm is one of the hardest things in the world to diagnose, because it's designed by nature, by physics, to disappear the moment you go looking for it in comfort." He paused. "Most people only ever test a problem in the conditions that are convenient for them. But problems don't happen in convenient conditions. They happen in the real ones." Eleanor sat down slowly on the low bench along the garage wall, holding the tiny cracked relay Walter had placed gently in her palm. It weighed almost nothing, and yet it had swallowed $2 million and 5 years of her life. 22 years, Walter said. "Aerospace propulsion. Plant closed in '09. Hasn't been much call for a 61-year-old fuel system specialist since." He gave a small, tired shrug, no bitterness in it, just fact. "A man's got to pay rent." Word of what happened in that garage spread through Whitfield logistics within a day, and from there it spread further, first through Meridian Falls, then through automotive forums, then through local news, then, within a week, through outlets far beyond the city. The story of the billionaire's widow and the janitor who solved what 17 experts could not became the kind of story people couldn't stop sharing, not because of the car, but because of what it represented. Eleanor didn't just pay Walter the $50,000 promised in the ad. She sat down with him personally, in her office, 2 days later, and asked him what he actually wanted to do with his life. Not what he needed to survive, but what he wanted. Walter, uncomfortable with the attention, admitted quietly that he missed engineering more than he let himself think about. He missed solving problems that mattered. He missed the feeling of holding a broken piece of machinery and understanding, truly understanding, why it had failed and how to make it right again. Eleanor created a position that hadn't existed before at Whitfield Logistics, Director of Mechanical Diagnostics, a role built specifically around Walter's rare talent for finding what other experts overlooked, applied not just to cars, but to the thousands of delivery vehicles, aircraft, and machinery that kept her company's global operations running. She didn't do it out of pity. She did it because in 20 minutes in a cold garage, Walter Briggs had shown her more genuine expertise than 17 credentialed specialists had shown her in 5 years combined. Walter accepted the job on one condition, one that surprised Eleanor deeply. He asked that Whitfield Logistics fund a small mentorship program for laid-off engineers and tradespeople over 50, people whose skills the market had quietly discarded simply because they no longer fit a resume algorithm's idea of youth and relevance. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, and within a year the program had placed over 60 experienced workers back into meaningful careers across her company and its partners. As for the Ferrari, Eleanor never sold it. She had it fully restored, cold-tested this time, in a specially built chamber that simulated winter mornings, exactly the way Walter had insisted every future repair be verified. She drove it herself for the first time in 5 years on a cold December morning, the anniversary of Richard's death, and this time, the engine didn't hesitate. It didn't hiccup. It ran clean and strong down the empty highway outside Meridian Falls, exactly the way her husband had once loved to drive it, exactly the way he'd promised her he would, one more time, before he never got the chance. She kept the tiny cracked relay in a small glass case on her office desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the most expensive experts in the world had missed something a quiet, overlooked janitor had found in under an hour, simply because he knew how to ask the right question, not what does the report say, but what actually happened, and under what real, honest conditions did it happen. Sometimes the answer to an impossible problem isn't found in the biggest office, the most expensive lab, or the most decorated resume. Sometimes it's found in the hands of someone the world stopped looking at, someone quietly mopping a floor at midnight, still carrying 22 years of hard-won knowledge that nobody thought to ask about. Walter Briggs never set out to be remembered. He just wanted to understand why a machine had stopped working, the same question he'd spent a lifetime asking, long before anyone offered him $50,000 to answer it. And Eleanor Whitfield, for the first time in 5 years, finally let herself believe that some things broken by grief and time could still, with the right hands and the right patience, run again. The end.